Good morning to you and welcome back to the Now Morning Show. I hope you have your tea and your coffee and get ready for your spotlight on Now with Kimberly D'Souza.
Now, the last time we had the founder of the Tobago Animal Hospital and president of the T&T Veterinary Association, Dr. Paul Crooks, on the program, we spoke about African swine flu and how to treat with it. But today, we're looking at the threat of rabies in Trinidad. Now, according to the World Health Organization, rabies occurs in more than 150 countries and territories and causes tens of thousands of deaths every year. And so this morning, we check in with Dr. Crooks. Dr. Crooks, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Good morning. Thank you for having me as usual.
Always a pleasure, especially on Tobago Thursday. Let's start with exactly what is rabies. Just give us an overview about this disease.
Well, I mean, people define diseases in different ways, but I want to say one specific thing about rabies, just like I said about African swine fever. It is a highly fatal viral disease of many mammalian species. Probably every mammalian species that you can think of, actually. The thing about rabies is even where I used high mortality for African swine fever, and we were looking at mortality upwards of 80%, rabies basically kills every animal that becomes sick. Basically everyone. If an animal or person survives an infection with rabies, that is basically a miracle.
Yeah. I know that you mentioned it affects, mammals, right, in particular, but I feel like people more attribute rabies to rats. Is there a particular reason why we look at that particular animal as one of the animals to spread this sort of disease?
It's quite possible that the belief that rabies is associated with small animals or wild animals is because in the countries where the ferocious form of rabies exists, those small or wild animals tend to be the animals that maintain rabies in the environment. In countries where the ferocious form of rabies exists, vaccination is generally widely practiced. Like in the United States, basically every pet animal is vaccinated for rabies. So how a person or animal might encounter a rabid animal would usually be through being exposed to a smaller wild animal, maybe a raccoon, some small rodent, and assuming that the animal, because the animal is behaving abnormally, the animal doesn't run away when you approach it. You think, okay, maybe I can pet this animal, maybe this animal needs help, and you reach out to that animal and then you're bitten. And that tends to be the way that rabies would spread in those countries.
Okay. And as we are, trying to ensure that our animals are safe, I mean, what sort of symptoms can we look out for to see if any of our animals have been infected by rabies?
So the first thing to note is we talked about rabies being a threat in Trinidad, but not Tobago. Why would that be? It's because in Trinidad and Tobago, we have what's commonly called the dumb form of rabies. That dumb form means that typically our animals don't become aggressive. And we usually see the vampire bat being the carrier of rabies and biting susceptible animals. So vampire bats in Trinidad, at different points in Trinidad, but usually around the southeast of the island, they bite susceptible animals. They bite horses, cattle, sheep, goats, humans. And the first sign I would say that should be of concern is the bat bite. Any type of wound or lesion that looks like it could be as a result of a bite is something to be concerned about. So the reason why I'm saying that is because this viral disease in particular has a very long incubation period. It takes many weeks or in some cases several months, before animals that are exposed to rabies start to get sick from rabies. So you have the vampire bat biting the animal, and as a farmer, you may say, wait, where's this bleeding wound or this cut, where's that from? Then you call your vet or your local agricultural unit. They come and check the animal and they realize that it was the bite of a vampire bat.
Yeah.
That bite is your first indication that you should communicate with your local agriculture unit. As far as if you ignore that or don't notice the bite, after several weeks or perhaps several months, the dumb form of rabies usually manifests as various types of neurological signs. So the brain is affected. You find that animals are maybe not moving around as they normally would. So they're circling, they're pressing their head into the wall, they're not eating. We do see that some animals salivate. Overall, the behavior changes. There may be a reduced appetite, but the signs are not necessarily specific to rabies. Mm-hmm. There are many other neurological diseases that cause similar signs. Yeah. And testing for rabies is not necessarily the easiest thing, but where we have cases that show those signs in areas where we have the vampire bat and the animal is not vaccinated, it is a fair assumption that that's a rabies case.
Yeah. Now, you would have mentioned vaccination, Dr. Crooks, as a way to prevent, the spread of rabies. But aside from that, I mean, how can, farmers and those who have livestock, how can they prevent and treat it? For example, if their animal has been infected by that vampire bat or that small rodent that transmitted the rabies disease?
So in human medicine, we are fortunate that there is the possibility of post-exposure vaccination. Mm-hmm. So even if you've been bitten by the vampire bat and never vaccinated for rabies before, because the rabies incubation period, that is the time from exposure to the time of sickness, because that period is such a long time, there's enough time to use vaccines, trigger an immune response, and get that immune response in a patient who's been bitten by a vampire bat. That works to some extent in animals as well, but usually if an animal starts to show clinical signs or a person starts to show clinical signs, there's definitely nothing you can do. Right. And regarding the exposure to the vampire bat, because the vampire bat is, as far as we're aware, the only vector in Trinidad and Tobago that transmits rabies, and because their migration patterns never take them to Tobago, we can basically inform farmers that the ones who are at risk are those who are living in the areas where the vampire bats fly and move around. Yeah. And again, that's more southeast Trinidad. People who are in the areas of the vampire bat should know, but call the Ministry of Agriculture. I'm not from Trinidad. I can't tell you the exact areas of concern.
Noted.
But you can call the Ministry of Agriculture if you want to know if your animals are at risk. And you can keep the animals in a relatively closed environment where bats are not permitted entry. All of that said, the reality is that that's not really practicable. For most people, vaccination is the only way to ensure that the animals stay safe. Right now, the Ministry of Agriculture is doing free vaccinations for all livestock to prevent rabies. So definitely all livestock farmers should contact the Ministry of Agriculture regarding that.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Crooks, you also mentioned, of course, that the vampire bats are the main sources of carriers or transmitters of the rabies disease as it relates to Trinidad. But in terms of, I mean, you would have mentioned the prevention as well. But I mean, how can we really ensure that we keep our animals safe? Okay, so you're saying that you need to vaccinate before. You're also saying that we can't keep them inside. But is there nothing else farmers can do to ensure that their animals are safe against the vampire bats?
Unfortunately, not really, because the bats can go wherever they like. Like, okay, if any of the viewers or you yourself have had the issue where you've had bats in your ceiling, not vampire bats, just regular fruit bats in your ceiling, we know how difficult it is to get them out once they've established. If you contact a professional pest control service, even they would tell you how difficult it is. If you contact wildlife organizations, they would tell you there are various ways that you could try to sort of scare bats off. People have used high frequency generators to make sounds. You can put lights. But really, none of those things work if you have bats living in your ceiling. They're living in your ceiling. They're not going anywhere. And that's unfortunately the reality for the vampire bats that carry rabies as well. They're basically impossible to get rid of. The way we monitor bats is by trapping and so on, but it's just not something that's feasible on a huge scale. And that's where, unfortunately, the only real workable method here to prevent exposure is vaccination. Well, prevent disease is vaccination.
Yeah. And as we talk about the status, Dr. Crooks, of rabies as it relates to Trinidad, can you provide us with an update on that? Is it?
Sorry.
Hello? Dr. Crooks, you hearing me now? Hello? Dr. Crooks, one more time. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you now. Yes,
okay,
sorry.
Good. Because I really wanted an answer to this question. I was asking about the status of rabies in Trinidad. Can you provide us with an update on that as well?
Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. Status of the rabies virus in Trinidad.
Okay, so we've had an increase in the number of rabies cases. I don't know if you would have had the story on TTT, but there was a bit of an epidemic in 2022 where for a long time vaccination had sort of fallen off, perhaps related to COVID as well. We had an increase in the number of cases, the number of reports of animals that appear to be rabid, the number of vampire bat bites. So the Ministry of Agriculture is taking that seriously and doesn't want rabies to be something that is killing our livestock. Because we have the dumb form, the risk to humans is generally very low. So the vampire bat is how you're exposed for the most part. So that vampire bat biting a human is uncommon, but can happen. And that's where, again, humans living in the high-risk areas can be vaccinated. And certainly if you're exposed to the vampire bat bite, you get yourself a vaccination. But other than that, it's virtually impossible that somebody who owns a sheep or horse that has been bitten by a vampire bat and later develop signs of rabies would then get rabies, because these animals don't bite humans. And the way that rabies is transmitted, the virus itself doesn't live for any long period of time in the environment. Probably, I don't want to lie about it, but definitely less than an hour. And therefore, you basically need the bites with the infected saliva to happen, and that the saliva is introduced to broken skin for the infection to move from one animal to another. And because these animals have the dumb form and they don't just snap randomly, the risk to humans there is low. So regarding the threat of rabies in Trinidad, we are looking at the vampire bat as the single vector that is really important. And for people in high-risk areas to consider vaccination for themselves and definitely get their animals vaccinated.
Yeah. And Dr. Crooks, before you go, just remind us where farmers and those with livestock can go to get their animals vaccinated.
Well, you can call the Ministry of Agriculture. You can visit their Facebook page. There is an anti-rabies unit, and the anti-rabies unit should be accessible through a hotline, I believe. I don't remember offhand.
Right.
And through that anti-rabies unit, you can find all the information on the Facebook page. You'll be able to organize to have your livestock vaccinated.
Great. Dr. Crooks, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I hope that the information that was shared, that farmers and everybody else can take the tips to secure their mammals. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good one. And that was Dr. Crooks. Of course, he is the president of the T&T Veterinary Association and founder of the Tobago Animal Hospital, just giving us an update on the threat of rabies in Trinidad. You're on the Now Morning Show. We're going to take a break and be right back. Stay with us.